but the beginning of our presentation.
When elephants died, they gave up their ivory. When people died, they left behind their history.
For over 180 years, Hong Kong Cemetery has been silently recording the life stories of people who are buried there. So today, in our presentation, we're going to show you how Hong Kong Cemetery tells us the cosmopolitan culture and colonial history of Hong Kong. Start with this, we'll first look at the symbols. By studying the symbols and designs of the gravestone, you'll be amazed by the diversity of people buried there. British soldiers, Chinese revolutionaries, or even Japanese prostitutes. Then, we have a deeper look at the history behind the monument. For example, the Opium War, or a fever outbreak in the 19th century. And besides all these huge monuments dedicated to groups of people, there are also individual gravestones that caught our attention. So we will ask, what kind of influence can individuals have on Hong Kong's history? Well, Sir Robert Hotum and Yang Qin's story will answer this question. Now, as soon as we walk into Hong Kong Cemetery, the first thing we notice that many gravestones are very different from each other. So, Odin, can you explain why are they so different?
Sure, Phyllis. Many of you may wonder how you can get to know the people buried here if you cannot understand the memorial words on the gravestone. Don't worry about this. With the symbols on the gravestone, it will be very easy for you to have some basic ideas about people's occupations and religious beliefs. Let's first look at symbols that represent people's occupations. Cannon, which is a kind of weapon, usually stands for a soldier in the army. If you see an anchor, a part of ship, people buried here is either a shipman or a navy guy. A cross with a snake around it is usually from a doctor. In Western culture, snake means cure and recovery, and a cross usually stands for blessing. So a cross with a snake around it is mostly from the doctor. Except for occupations, symbols can also tell you about people's religious beliefs. Ivan?
Thanks, Odin. Yeah, as Odin said, symbol on the gravestone can also tell us the religious belief of people who buried there. For example, a cross for those who believe in Christian and Catholic. There is also another special kind of cross with a diagonal line on it, which looks like a feng word in Chinese, which belongs to those who believe in Orthodox Church. And of course, there are also some other people who believe in other religions, such as Buddhism or Jewish. Though we were not able to understand the memorial words that are written on the gravestone, we could at least distinguish the language that are used. Most commonly used language are English and Chinese, but there are also some other languages, such as French, German, Portuguese, Spanish, and even Japanese. This shows us how cosmopolitan Hong Kong actually has been since a long time ago. Now, with the basic knowledge on the symbol, why don't we take a closer look to some monuments that are standing on the Hong Kong Cemetery and see whether there's an interesting story behind it, Phyllis?
Thank you, Ivan. So when we first walked into Hong Kong Cemetery, the first thing that caught our attention were the huge monuments dedicated to groups of people. And one of them is of special value. It is in memory of soldiers who died in the First Opium War, which is also known as the Anglo-Chinese War. I know many of you have learned about this in your high school history. And just like me, know that Hong Kong Island was the first place occupied by Great Britain. Well, but reading about history is really different from how you feel when you actually stand in front of a monument in memory of that war. That monument was dedicated to HMS Cornwallis, the flagship of British Navy in the First Opium War. HMS here stands for Her Majesty's Ship, and Congolese was a famous ship because 19 treaty was signed on it. But just to remind you, according to Chinese high school history textbook, the third article of the 19 treaty stated that Hong Kong will become the colony of Great Britain. So on the monument, there are names of officers who died in action. At that time, they were buried as heroes. But today, they carry the name as invaders. We often say that history will tell, but really, even history itself is such a fluid concept that it changes as time goes by and read by different people in different ways. Anyhow, there's one fact that we can find out from this monument. That is, Chinese soldiers without modern weapons were not as weak as we thought. In the book, The Nemesis in China, even the British writer himself admitted that Chinese soldiers had proven themselves to be great fighters in the Battle of Zhenjiang. But he also emphasized that the most dangerous enemies for the British were not the Chinese, but low marsh fever and cholera. This is supported by a monument not far away from the monument dedicated to HMS Congolese. On this monument, there are 96 names on it, in memory of people who died in a fever outbreak in 1864. In today's Hong Kong, you might probably have heard of a monument dedicated to people who died in SARS outbreak in 2002. But can you imagine that there has long been such a monument of exactly the same kind, over 100 years ago? That's why I especially value this monument, because it recorded the value of ordinary lives. Now, all these monuments I've talked about were groups monuments that in memory of groups of people who left their influence on the history. What about individuals? Can individuals influence Hong Kong history too? Well, in Hong Kong Cemetery, there are two important individual gravestones. Now, let's first welcome Ivan to introduce Sir Robert Hutton.
Thanks, Phyllis. So, have you ever been to Hong Kong U? There is a hall there named after his name. And also in Macau, there is a public library named after his name. So, who is he? He was the wealthiest and one of the most important businessmen in Hong Kong back then. He was a typical third cultural kid. His father was an Englishman and his mother was a Chinese. He went to a traditional Chinese school at his early age and moved to a Western college at the age of 12. His multicultural background and education helped him a lot in building his strong commercial network while he was working for a big British firm. And this strong connection helped him in being successful in a lot of his investment in various areas such as shipping, trading, finance, and real estate, which makes him the richest person in Hong Kong. Well, born in Hong Kong and being educated in a traditional Chinese school at his early age made him consider himself more of a Chinese than a Eurasian, even though he looks like a Eurasian. He preferred Chinese costume rather than Western suit, even when he was attending an important meeting in Britain. Well, he was also concerned about Chinese affairs, that he founded the Chinese Club and became its first president. But at the same time, he was also given the title of Knight by King George V and the Queen of Britain. So now we can see that this person was influential both to the Chinese and to the Western communities, which makes him successful in his business. An interesting fact is that even though he considered himself as a Chinese, right before his death, it picks a Western belief that is Catholic. That's why you can easily find his gravestone, which looks like a big white cross, spanning to another big white cross, which is his first wife's gravestone. Now that it's quite easy to find this interesting person had gravestone. But there is also another important person in the history of Hong Kong, but his gravestone has no information on it. Ollie?
Thanks, Ivan. This monument belongs to Yang Qiyun, a Chinese revolutionary. When we mention the revolutionary organization, Revive China Society, the first person who comes to mind must be Sun Yat-sen. But as you may not know it, the first president of this society is Yang Qiyun, but not Sun Yat-sen. Yang's gravestone is empty, even without a name on it. That's because he was murdered by the killers of the Qing government. After this tragedy, his friends tried every way and finally got the chance to bury him in Hong Kong cemetery secretly. They wanted to prevent his tomb from being destroyed by the Qing government, and also they didn't want to get into trouble when they went to visit him in the festival, so they left the monument empty. The only thing that could indicate his identity was that crank in the middle of the monument, which means he was murdered and died before his time. Yang Qiyun was only one of the revolutionaries that used Hong Kong as a base for their fight of a new China. Hong Kong was not merely a colony of Britain. It was like a cradle of the new China, where these revolutionaries risked their lives to spread new ideas and beliefs to mainland China. Without Hong Kong serving as such a base, it might take many more years for China to step out of the feudalism and become a modern country. Now that you've seen the role of Yang Qiyun and even the Hong Kong city in the history of China, Ivan, do you think that it's really amazing that these are just recorded in Hong Kong cemetery?
Yes, absolutely, Ollie. So today in our presentation, we have shown you how Hong Kong Cemetery can tell us the colonial history and the cosmopolitan culture of Hong Kong. Well, in China Daily, Professor Joseph Ting says that there is no actually better place to study the Hong Kong history than the cemetery. And I hope that all of you will agree with him after what we have shown you in our presentation today. First, we have talked about the symbols, the interesting facts about the symbols, and how can we get to know the religious belief and the occupation of the people buried by looking through the symbols on the gravestone. We have also shown you how cosmopolitan Hong Kong actually has been since the last century. Then we have talked about a monument that represents an interesting story of the Hong Kong history, that is the Opium War. Lastly, we have talked about two important people who influenced the history of Hong Kong, Sir Robert Hotung and Yang Qiyun. So when you are sitting in the library trying to study Hong Kong history, you feel tired and bored, why don't you just take a walk at the Hong Kong Cemetery?
Thank you.